Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen. This is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, a gathering place for fellow fiends the world over to discuss all things freaky and frightening. If you want to be part of the conversation, and I hope you do, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, maybe go back and check out some of our previous episodes, leave a comment, and most importantly, let us know the fright flicks you'd like to discuss in the future. That kind of connection is exactly what we're looking for, and it really does make a difference. We're all about sharing the scare, and we want to hear from you. Dellamorte Dellamore, aka Cemetery Man, is arguably the last great Italian horror movie of that country's heyday, and yet somehow still struggles for a place of respect amidst the masters. Originally a novel by Tziano Sclavi, and later adapted by Gianni Romoli and directed by Argento protege Michele Soavi, the story follows Buffalora Cemetery groundskeeper Francesco Dellamorte, who spends his days helping the living put their loved ones to rest, and his nights keeping the dead in the ground. He sleepwalks through life, gunning down zombies and leafing through old phone books, with only the semi-mute Gnaghi as his companion, until one day he meets a young and stunning widow who awakens passion within him. An array of comic misadventures follows, with enough bloodshed, nudity, and WTF moments to satisfy the gorehounds, yet elevated by its extraordinary camera work, gorgeous score, and thoughtful meditations on life, death, love, and human existence. Tonight we'll celebrate this exemplary slice of zombie cinema on its 30th anniversary, and I've invited a wonderful panel of guests to join with me, so let's bring everybody in. And let's say hello to Ryan Olson of the Synapse Films podcast.
Hello.
Dave M. Gray of Raiders of the Podcast.
Hello.
Lawrence P. Raffle of FearNet.
Hey, everyone.
And John Kitley of Kitley's Crypt, Horror Hound Magazine, and Discover the Horror Podcast.
Good morning.
And we are here to discuss Dellamorte Dellamore from 1994, celebrating its 30th anniversary, aka Cemetery Man. Yes, we have to call it that. I'm sorry. It's Dave Gray is responsible for writing the essay on Dellamorte Dellamore for the Hidden Horror book that several of us contributed to. When I reached out to people, the way the Hidden Horror Project occurred was that I asked people to nominate their favorite kind of underrated horror films, and Dellamorte came to mind. Why was it like the top of your list?
It's one of my favorites. And when I got the option, of course, it's one I've never stopped talking about. You know what? I actually remember when you first reached out, I had just badgered someone into buying a used DVD copy of it at a local used store because they had one. And I was like, dude, you got to buy this. No, you've got to buy this right now. I know I don't know you, but you're buying this fucking thing right fucking now. And they did. So, I felt very, very, full of myself.
And you said, you know what? Now I'm going to push my feelings on everybody in written form.
Yeah. I wept editing that thing. I still have nightmares about that.
Ryan, what was your first experience with Dellamorte Dellamore?
It was in an issue of Fango. It was on one of the sidebars. They had I think it was a shot of one of the zombies, and it said Dellamorte Dellamore. And I was a pretty religious reader of the mag, so I got it and read the article, and I thought it was, sounded really interesting and fascinating. So I think it was 96 when it had a brief theatrical run. And I knew the alternate title was Cemetery Man because they mentioned it in the article, if memory serves. And I saw it in the newspaper just looking. I was like, Cemetery Man? And it was playing at some little dive indie theater. And they did 2 showings of it. And of course, I went and saw it with a buddy of mine that was completely blown away. And I mean, a mutual good friend of ours, I found out later on, Dave from Liquid Cheese, was at the same screening as I was, but we would not meet until a few months later. And actually, which was kind of wild. But yeah, seeing it on the big screen back then, I mean, it just, blew me away. And I've been a ravenous fan ever since.
Awesome. John, how about you?
Probably the same thing, reading about it in Fango, but I was also a fan of Michele Soavi's work prior to. And this is also in the bootleg days. So my first copy was barely watchable in Italian. So having no idea what really was going on, but the imagery just blew me away. And then I finally upgraded to a decent copy, still in Italian. and then went back to a shitty copy in English to a finally good copy in English back in the good old VHS days. So now the fact that this is on a 4K Blu-ray or 4K disc is just amazing how far we've come.
Lawrence, how about you? What was your initial experience?
I think I may have actually told the story on this show before. It's kind of similar to Ryan and John's experiences. I was big in bootlegs in the 90s, and I first saw it on a bootleg VHS. I think it had either subtitles or was dubbed, so I did understand what was going on. Unlike Ryan, I did not know that the American title was Cemetery Man. So one weekend, I was flipping through the paper to see what movies were playing, and Cemetery Man was playing at a small theater in downtown Philly. So I was like, go see a new horror movie. Sure, why not? And back then, art house kind of had like a different meaning. So if stuff was playing downtown at one of those theaters, you kind of knew it was probably worthwhile. So I went down. As soon as it started, I was like, oh my God, this is Dellamorte Dellamore. So I was like pretty excited, actually, because I got to see it in a theater projected on film and wasn't expecting that. So it didn't really feel like a bait and switch. I was pretty happy that I was actually sitting there with like 3 other people in the theater watching the movie.
Well, you kind of just highlighted my next point, which is this doesn't seem to be a movie that gets talked about in the same way. It's not like first or second or third on somebody's list when they're saying, hey, you're getting into Italian horror. Why don't you check out, Dellamorte? Like they usually are going with the Argentos or the Falchis or things like that. Any thoughts on that? Like, why do you feel like it kind of gets a second run status?
I don't know if I would classify this strictly as horror because it bounces all over the place. It's a comedy. It's got romance, but it does have its horror elements, but it doesn't feel like what we would consider straight out horror from Italy. But it checks all the boxes. But I think the visuals are, to me, what really highlights this above most of the other stuff.
I would agree with John. I think availability obviously has something to do with it. I don't think it's a movie that's really like been available much, to be honest. But really, it's to John's point, it's not quite what you would think of as being like a traditional horror movie or like a zombie movie. But I do think that it is one of the best zombie movies. I mean, it's top 10 for me. But it's not really discussed as an option when you're talking about zombie movies. You talk about Dawn of the Dead, the Romero movies, that sort of thing. But a lot of times people kind of overlook it because it does kind of span, multiple genres. And its absurdity really does kind of carry the film. So like if you're not really feeling that, then you probably wouldn't feel the movie either. So you have to be okay with like the world that it sets up for you. You have to be willing to kind of just go along with it because it does progressively get more absurd as the movie goes on, which I personally love, but I know some people wouldn't really go for that sort of thing.
I got a few thoughts. They sold it wrong. I mean, because I remember the marketing at the time, they sold it as a straight zombie film, and you can't do that for this. The title is terrible. I mean, the English title is terrible. And this is a recurring issue with Sclavi full stop in the U.S. I mean, Dylan Dogs sell millions of copies a week internationally in multiple countries, and it had 6-issue run in the U.S. at that time. Nobody bought. It's too hard to sell to an American audience. None of it checks into a little box.
I don't know. It's hard for me to really say why it's like that because for me, everybody I know that's seen it loves the movie,
right,
and talks highly about it. So like, I don't run into too many people that have seen it and don't care for it. And over the years, that's kind of been one of those things where we meet people, and if we're talking about Italian movies, I mean, it comes up pretty quickly in a lot of conversations that I've been fortunate to be in. But, so I guess I have a little bit different experience than the other fellas here do. So, I mean, for me, it's always kind of been pretty highly regarded, and rightfully so. I mean, for me, it's probably top 10 of all time Italian in my list.
Well, Michele Soavi, I think, is also not... He seems to sometimes be an afterthought as well. You talk about Falchi, you talk about Martino, you talk about Argento, but eventually you get around to Soavi. But he's not somebody who is he's not an entryway point. I think that's maybe part of it, is that he is somebody you work into seeing after you go through Falchi and Argento, Bava, etc. He's
the second, or technically the third generation Italian directors, because
right.
once you get past the ones you mentioned, then you get into Lamberto Bava and Luigi Cozzi and then Soavi. So he's in there. The minute you say Italian zombie films, you got Fulci, you got, God forbid, Bruno Mattei. You got all these other ones, and you're thinking zombies. Dellamorte is its own sub genre of film.
Right.
So I think that's the reason like to Ryan's point, everybody loves this film, but it's not the first thing that comes to mind when you think zombie film because it is so radically different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a criticism. It's just, it is its own little niche thing. And it does what it does fuckingly amazing, but it's not what you would immediately thought, or most people would immediately thought when you're talking Italian zombies or zombies in general.
He also has a limited number of films. I mean,
Right.
after there's no horror. Now, maybe I'm forgetting something, but I don't think there's a single horror in his career after this. There's a lot of romances. There's a couple war movies and a whole bunch of TV miniseries.
Yeah.
And before this, there's The Church and Stage Fright and The Sect. Because everybody else, you go to an Italian, there's 1,000 movies.
Right.
Should there be? Maybe not, but they're there.
But this was also at a time where Italian film industry pretty much bottomed out and
Yeah.
everybody went to work for TV.
I do consider it like kind of the last great Italian horror film, and that's not a knock on those that followed. It just, it was really hard for them to get their films seen. The casting of Rupert Everett, I would have thought would have elevated its profile. It's probably why it got a U.S. release in the theaters, because he was starting to become a name that was recognizable. But again, it didn't change the world for him. Although it was funny seeing, Cemetery Man, and then like the next year he does My Best Friend's Wedding and becomes everybody's favorite, gay sidekick.
If I remember directly after this movie, he didn't want anything to do with it. I think him and Soavi kind of butted heads during the production. And right afterwards, he didn't list this on his filmography. He didn't want anything to do with it. He's obviously since come around and appreciate what it is. But I think initially he kind of played into the same old, it's a horror film. I don't really want to be involved in that, which is weird. And that's why I think he did this, is because he wasn't a big star at the time.
This was a great, nice lead role for him.
Yep.
And they definitely wanted him because, as you point out in your essay, Dave, like Sclavi had used his likeness for the Dylan Dog comic. Ryan, on this, the new 4K Blu-ray that's come out, who else has that new release? Okay. All right. Well, good. We'll talk to all of you, but I'm going to go with Ryan to start. What would you say are some of the highlights from that release?
Oh man. I mean, well, obviously the way the movie looks itself is the number one highlight because it looks absolutely phenomenal. There's so much detail and incredible stuff that you don't see within the sets and the design and everything. And I mean, some of the effects, yes, they're a little bit more noticeable, but they still look fantastic. So to me, that is a testament to how well done the effects are, because they still look great. Even if there are, once in a while you can see the strings, like with the blue lights, or I don't know. I think the movie obviously is the big part, but there's such an incredible wealth of extras. I mean, you've got, whole disc dedicated to it. They talk to pretty much all the principal people. Unfortunately, Gnaghi was not with us anymore, so he's not represented on there, but you do get, Fabiana Formica doing one of her first things talking about it. And, obviously Rupert's on there, and Anna Falchi, and, they get a host of the technicians, from the screenwriter to the cinematographer, set design. A lot of the technical people are involved in it as well. The score creator, there's a great interview with him. There's an awesome book in there, which I haven't had a chance to read that yet. I watched all the extras except for the commentaries, and a lot of great stuff, a lot of great information. I mean, if you're a fan of the movie, it's pretty much definitive. I mean, you're going to get everything you could ever want and then some.
Well, I watched it with John last weekend because I had my old Anchor Bay DVD. You can see that string like on the fly. I watched it on the DVD and you can't see it. I'm really happy that it's getting the Gold Star treatment. Dave, how about you? What's some highlights from this new release?
Well, there's the soundtrack disc. I have an ancient van that has a CD player in it, so that lives in there now. Yep. Unlike you guys, I didn't get to see it in the big screen. I first saw it at home, crappy TV. So, like, it's gorgeous. Like, I knew it was pretty. Like, my head was like, yeah, this is a pretty movie. I see what they're going. But holy shit. Like, I did not realize how, especially the first act, when they're doing the classic paintings in the ossuary and stuff. It's just gorgeous. And again, like, I knew that on an intellectual level, but not on the visceral level. It really does drive that home, especially in the first act, in the last act, in the hospital scene. It just looks so nice.
And did you say that it's playing on the big screen somewhere?
It is. Here, close to me, the Alamos are starting to show it. But we have a few very dedicated horror groups. I don't know how wide it is.
I have an older German Blu-ray release, I believe it is. It's a hard box, the one that has that really not safe for work cover. And it's a decent transfer. I mean, even on that edition, and I'm sure the new one is light years ahead. Especially with like a definition around like some of like the lighting and the background and that sort of thing. But you can still see kind of like the string holding the little blue lights. And when I saw it on this edition, that was like the first time that I noticed like, you know, some of the deficiencies and some of the special effects. But it's like still a decent release. And thank you for giving me the excuse to rewatch it, which I did the other night. And I was thankful that I had that excuse to watch again because I haven't seen it in so long. But I'm sure the new one's great. I just I'm trying to kind of scaling back a little bit on my purchases as I stare at my wall of still wrapped Blu-rays and 4K Ultra HDs that I have not opened yet. So I'm just trying to be like, you know, cautious about that stuff and trying to get through my existing collection.
I think the thing about this film in general is the cinematography, the visuals. So seeing this in 4K, I mean, I do have a little complaint about because of the clarity, you can see a lot of faults more so than we did before, like the makeup and stuff, as Ryan mentioned. But because it is a visual film, what you do see is just stunning. Even the opening titles that seem to almost 3D, where they they glow off the screen, to the scene where he's burning the leaves and death appears. So many unbelievable sequences in the cemetery at night. Everything is crystal clear. Yep. So it is, it's mind blowing. Pardon the pun. How beautiful this looks. And even the thing about this film is if you want to get somebody, that opening sequence with the telephone cord, if that does not hook a film fan, then they just need to leave and go back to watching, you know, the Marvel movies or something, because that opening sequence alone is just unbelievable.
Yes. The interview with the cinematographer is fantastic on the special features because they go really in depth into that, talking about all the various scenes, like the pulling back, you know, seeing the cord and going down through the crack to see Gnaghi, and like the sequence where they are burning all the newspaper and the leaves and then death appears. And he goes into depth about how they created all those shots and how they did that stuff. It's great. I mean, for film fans, you will really, really enjoy that because they do take a pretty deep dive into the nuts and bolts of how the movie was made.
Dave, in your essay, you talk about how Soavi was an Argento protege. He worked on a lot of projects with Dario Argento. And you said that in his earlier efforts, he was maybe aping Argento too much. It feels like he's kind of coming into his own style in things like The Church and The Sect, and especially this one. What are some of the things you would say, like, are some distinctive moments?
Well, the use of color does reek of Argento, but it's very purposeful. The framing, I think, is very different and unique. And just the voice throughout and how it uses the space. The Sect does it also, where it's a bit more dynamic, even the use of blank space. I'm not a big Argento fan, so, you know, if I say things that people go, what is wrong with you? When I slam down on him a little, I'm sorry. But Argento does gorgeous full, but it's always big, you know? And Soavi can take small. Like, again, the cemetery has a lot of blank space. but it all works and it informs the scene itself, which I don't think a lot of other Italians do, especially not at that time. Everything had to be a big full set with a bright orange background.
Rupert Everett is terrific in the lead role. And I love, and I'm going to butcher his name, Francois Hadji-Lazaro as Gnaghi. But of course, there's Anna Falchi, who made a big impression on a lot of us, I'm sure.
Yeah, I have I bought the Japanese Laserdisc, which I have hanging up in my office because of it's probably the same cover that Lawrence mentioned on the Blu-ray or the German release, with her straddling him on the cemetery on the plot. Yeah, that will get you to watch the movie no matter what.
Any other thoughts on Anna Falchi other than wow?
I mean, you know, well, there is wow.
Yeah.
But she plays 3 different roles
That's the thing.
incredibly well. And I think that gets overlooked because she does look fantastic naked. I mean, but she's fantastic. All 3 are separate and distinct.
Yeah.
And with very little screen time. And that alone is incredibly impressive.
I think he does a great job of combining beauty and the macabre, like Perfect is in the ossuary.
Yeah.
Yep.
The way it's shot in the slow motion with the veil and the recreation of the paintings and stuff. And then you have this beautiful woman and Rupert Everett, who's a pretty dashing looking guy. I mean, it's everything is beautiful, and you're encased in walls of skulls and bones. And I tell you what, there's no way in hell I would have stepped into that water, because you basically have human soup there.
Yeah.
And they're just like, oh, this is awesome. And I mean, ka-chunk in there. Hell no.
I don't know.
She literally takes her shoes off
Yeah.
before she steps in there too. So
I don't know. I think it depends on who I'm with. I'm not gonna lie.
well, I suppose if you're with Anna Falchi, I mean, you know,
I'm indifferent.
you're not going to really gonna argue.
Yeah.
But it was also, that was the first time I'd even heard of the concept of an ossuary. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
What are they doing? Italians are weird. Argento and Bava, they all kind of create these great screen pictures, like where you could just take a frame grab and be like, I could hang that on my wall.
Yeah.
And I feel like that happens numerous times throughout this movie.
I can't watch the burning leaf sequence without. I got something in my eyes. It's just done so well.
Yeah.
But also to your point, I think he does a great job in like the first 5 minutes of the movie informing you of what kind of movie you're about to see.
Yeah.
And you fall right into it. And it's like, and like I said earlier, it just gets more and more absurd, but you never once question the absurdity. There's like that one scene where Gnaghi takes Valentina's head out of the cemetery, and then like the head just kind of like follows him as he's like leaving the cemetery with like a homemade violin. And it's so weird, but it's also so great. And it's like every single piece of that is so inconsequential, but it all works so well together, from like the way the head's kind of like crawling out of the cemetery to the tune he's playing on the violin to his whole disposition about the whole thing, being in love with her. The whole thing is just so weird, but also like great at the same time. It's just, I can't even describe it. It's just like, you can either accept it or you can't accept it, I guess, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that's just it. Like it's a great way of world building where you're like, this is the world we're in, where you're talking on the phone and then suddenly, a dead guy shows up at your door and you have to shoot him and go drag him back out and bury him again. Like that's the world we're in.
Nothing makes sense. Yep. And even in the storyline, to Lawrence's point, like when they're digging up the mayor's daughter, he knows what's in there. And he's just like, okay. And then when he hears her calling and he starts to walk away and he leans over to the cop and goes, plot thickens. I mean, it's like he's aware of the absurdity of what's going on, but it's like, okay, let's just go with it.
And I just got that joke for the first time. Plot thickens. Oh. Can we talk about our actor who plays Gnaghi, Francois Hadji-Lazaro? I think it's a terrific, considering he doesn't have any dialogue. It's all done through physicality, and his one, line that he has is just, yeah. That is true. He has another line. Spoiler. What are people's thoughts on Francois Lazaro or favorite moments of Gnaghi?
I love the scene where he's watching the documentary with the headphones on. All hell is breaking loose, and he knows it's going on because they try to draw and just not. No, he wants to watch his shit. I think that the performance itself is a lot more layered than it also gets credit for.
Right.
Much like Falchi, everything is seen through Francesco Dellamorte's viewpoint.
Yes.
So that's why I don't quite get the folks being curious about the ending, because it's the first time he's seeing him as something else than a sidekick to look down on. But he does he does these little asides throughout the film, which is something I really, really noticed on the 4K. Facial expressions, just little things in the background to show that there is more to Gnaghi than what we are explicitly told.
Yeah, he's not the village idiot. He has a lot going on. Francesco Dellamorte is kind of a shit. Like he treats his best friend horribly and diminishes him constantly and doesn't give him equal space in the relationship. And you see that all register with Gnaghi. And I think that's to credit to the performance, is that Gnaghi knows how he's perceived, but he also knows he's not an idiot. And he also knows he has feelings. And he also, he's a full-blooded character.
Plus, with his performance being, for the most part, nonverbal, comedy is not easy to do. And he's not playing it for laughs. He's playing it completely straight, but it's a humorous performance.
Yeah.
And when he's eating there, watching that documentary, and whatever he's eating is dripping down, and just the look of his eyes going back and forth, and then the dead Boy Scout lands on him, he just kind of shrugs him off because he's going to watch. But then when his TV blows up, the look of horror on his face, it's like, that's my one thing.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, but I just think overall he portrays that character with an extreme sense of you feel very you feel for him, you understand sort of where he is and who he is, and I think that's very hard to do. To John's point, comedy is hard to do, but horror comedy is probably the hardest thing to do. I feel like we can all count maybe on two hands some of the best horror comedies of all time, and then list another 1,000 failures, right? So it's just a very difficult thing to do. All of these characters, even the ones that aren't the best characters, all kind of play off of sympathy, they're very sympathetic characters. Even Francesco, he's not the nicest guy in the world, but he's still kind of sympathetic to a certain extent, because he's teased for being impotent, but then he wants to be impotent because he wants to get the girl and he's just looking for love. So you kind of feel for him. And it does also kind of set this up in a way where you can sort of feel for each of these characters. But Gnaghi especially, that I can't imagine anybody else pulling off a role like that. And, it really is amazing to watch.
Well, I mean, obviously all the stuff with Valentina is great. All that is great stuff. But I also like how they show you that he's much more intelligent than he may let on or see when he goes and puts the skull together really quick. Mm-hmm. They take that moment where he goes and he just it's no big deal, he's done it 100 times before, puts it together and then kind of takes it back apart. And it might have been Dave that said we see the movie through Francesco's eyes. So I almost wonder if the whole concept of him kind of being a dullard or whatever you want to say is more what he's applying to him, and maybe he's clearly more intelligent and has more facets to him than we see, and that maybe with the spoiler at the end when he sees him and he actually does speak, that it's almost for the first time he's looking at him seeing him as he really is, and not through this lens that Dellamorte has been putting on him throughout the majority of the time they've been together.
That scene with the skull, I felt like it's kind of a key moment where, yes, he knows how to solve the puzzle, and he knows that Francesco doesn't, or that Francesco is working at it, and he purposely doesn't, let on.
Right.
I think for a double reason, so that he could be seen the way he's seen, but also so that Francesco doesn't feel less than.
There's also the scene where they're with the fire, and he throws the phone books on the fire.
Right.
And Francesco freaks out. And Gnaghi has that moment of seriously? It's a phone book. but it almost for the minute there reverses the intelligence because that's all Francesco knows. What he's read is a phone book, and it's my favorite book. And Gnaghi's like, what? So there's these little moments in there that it does show you different sides of not only Gnaghi, but also Francesco as well.
Yep.
That phone book, I mean, just the whole inclusion of it, I think is a really wonderful metaphor. And it just kind of heightens like how smart this movie actually is.
Yeah.
That this is a book of names and it's people he'll never meet in life, but he knows he'll get to meet them in death because they all got to come here.
Yeah.
As we're introduced to Francesco, he is kind of just sleepwalking through life. He's not looking to engage with anything. Like he's kind of found a place that feels safe for him. And when Anna Falchi shows up as the widow, that wakes something up in him. And I'm kind of wondering, like, is that just kind of like a fairy tale? Like, and then one day he met this beautiful girl and he realized that, you know, he had sexual feelings. Like, it just feels like what, you know, like what was his life before that moment?
And I think this is one of the reasons why this is a hard sell as a horror movie. A lot of horror movies are about fear of death and bodily harm. But Francesco doesn't have that. He's scared of the living. And this is a film about someone finding their life and moving forward as a human being. Usually something like this would be a drama. And this is instead a horror comedy. Whatever is before that does not matter. It's a man hiding out in a cemetery. That's why they have rumors about him in town. Here's a pretty guy. He has no woman. He must be impotent. And everybody believes that the moment they show up. I think it's the first thing everyone says to him. I think the mayor says it. The cop says it. Like the only person who doesn't say it is Gnaghi, who's probably heard him, you know, rub one out at night. But everybody else comments on it because why else would this guy be alone in a cemetery?
Well, it also shows you the change in Francesco because in the beginning he wants more money or he wants to get out because of the extra work he has to do. Then when he realizes he's going to be out of a job, okay, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. So it's a change of perception. But then the girl shows up, so it also things change in his direction of life of what he wants to do. So, and I've always been under the assumption that maybe the three girls are completely different women. Oh yeah, but not to him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He sees the exact same woman.
Which is interesting because Valentina is the only one who isn't her, you know, in terms of primary female characters.
Yeah.
But the last one gets a name, which the other two do not.
Right.
So there is progression. It might not be the healthiest progression, but there is progression in his view of these women.
Yeah.
Also.
Well, and we'll go into spoilers. I mean, more overtly into spoilers now. But the idea of like how the beginning of the movie and the second half of the movie they're very different. He becomes somebody who murders the living, you know, and he becomes less of a hero and more of an anti-hero.
Because of the whole dream state the film kind of is, there's even moments that you question what is really going on because the whole hospital scene just seems surreal right from the beginning. The way it's shot, the way that this room seems to be completely secluded in the dark. So something is happening. He's killing people, but it really makes you wonder on what we're seeing and what reality is. Because, I mean, the whole absurdity of him shooting the nurse or the nun, I think it was, and then the other doctor walks in, "Sister, what are you doing on the floor?" I mean, the back of her head's blown off. So it's just one of those, like, what the fuck is going on? And again, the cop, Mickey Knox, he was in Michele Soavi's first movie, Stage Fright, just some of the shit he comes up with. Like, we know it can't be you because you're impotent. They have a burnt check from the hooker. Well, we know it's not you.
Yep.
Oh, you have a gun. Good. You can protect yourself. You're just like, what reality am I living in that this guy's a cop for more than a day?
This one? Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
This
That's what I'm on. So the whole movie is on this dreamlike state of what is really happening in real life and what are we seeing?
And that feeds into the
Yeah.
whole thing about him wanting credit for the murders, and no matter what he does, he can't get credit for the murders.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's this thing with him wanting to be known as, I'm the guy who's been killing everyone, but nobody wants to give him the credit.
I mean, if he's actually even doing it, it could, because his whole relation, we assume that at the end that his relationship with Franco is fake. But how much of this is him hero worshiping this guy? Because he is asleep, but you hear things. Guns are loud. You never know if some dude's telling you his plan over the phone.
Kind of going along with that, the stuff with the murders, what you just said, John, about like it's 3 different women all played by the same actress. Like, what is that? I feel like that's a commentary on the male gaze, how men just see what they want to see, that they're looking purely at the physical outside. They're looking purely at what can this woman do for me.
It's not necessarily a gaze. This is the woman that made something come alive in Dellamorte, to put it mildly. So that's what he is focused on. So that's what he sees on every time he sees a woman that he has inspired by, I guess, he sees that image. He sees that woman.
Well, yeah, but it is also a statement on that. I think now maybe not in the narrative, but in the meta narrative, because he always destroys her, and he doesn't know anything about these women, just whatever he sees in them that he is drawn to, and that's a recurring Dylan dog joke. Also, he falls in love with every woman he meets, but Dylan actually sees different women. No, he falls in love with every woman. He sees them all exactly the same. And he then ultimately destroys them. And that is very much a comment on how men treat women. I think it's really hard to argue otherwise. I
think the difference, though, is the last one is the only one that is all-out murder. The first 2, he was doing his job as the caretaker.
But I also feel that's a bit of a stretch for the first one, because he knows he kills her by the end. I mean, it might not have been intentional. And then for the second one, he goes to try to destroy a piece of himself for his own desire for her. He still doesn't see her as an individual. It's not about that relationship. It's about his controlling it and being able to own it.
So what's so good about the movie really is the fact that you can have multiple interpretations of what's happening.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the reasons. So it's like that when she first reanimates, does he think he killed her? Does he not know that he killed her? So it's unclear in a lot of these things. So really, it's that's part of the beauty of it, is the different interpretations. It's pretty deep for a movie like this.
Well, with the original with the widow, I mean, I think that at least to me, it seemed pretty obvious that when she rises in the ossuary, she wasn't dead like he thought she was, and he shot her, and that's where she actually died. And then she resurrects and comes out of the grave, and that's when he sees her, when she's got the mandrake in her and she's all amazing looking with all the cool wind behind her and all that stuff. So, and then after she dies there that second time, he has the realization that, holy cow, she wasn't dead originally when I had her in the ossuary. So, because I mean, they clearly show you that one of the differences with zombie movies in this one is that the bites don't kill you. So even though she was bitten by her dead husband, she didn't necessarily die from that like he might have thought, because obviously she bites him and he never turns. He doesn't die. None of that happens. So that part of the zombie thing isn't potent in this movie in that respect. So at least that's how I've always took it, is that clearly he, was tormented by the fact that he actually did kill her.
Which could also set off when he starts to realize that he will kill people then. Because he killed her and she was alive.
Well, because all the death fantasies really accelerate after that point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think you're right. When he first does it, he doesn't realize, but he does in the course of the film.
Well,
when she comes back.
Yeah.
We also have the biker and his girlfriend, like that whole scene, where he accidentally kills
Claudio.
A living for. Oh my gosh, that is such a fun, ridiculous relationship. And I love that we get a reference to Psychomania with the motorcycle roaring up out of the grave. That
great effects.
My wife happened to walk in as that scene was going on, and I think she immediately wrote it off as just one more idiotic Italian horror film. I'm like, no, come back.
Oh yeah,
It's a fantastic sequence.
Can you get any more blatant than a school bus full of Catholic nuns and fascist Boy Scouts running over kids?
Right, the political commentary.
Wow.
And how about the song when they're doing the funeral procession too, of what they're all singing? I mean, that's, just adds on top of it.
I saw this movie around the same time as I saw Peter Jackson's Dead Alive, aka Brain Dead, and I feel like it traffics in kind of a similar tone where things are absurd, they're outrageous. I think that Soavi's vision is just kind of a little more artistic in a conventional sense. Like it feels more painterly, not taking anything away from Peter Jackson's artistic eye. But they were two films that I feel like I've always associated them together, because I feel like they kind of have that. If you like one, you'll probably like the other.
two way different directions in both tone and outlook and stuff, and one of them a lot more red.
Yeah.
But both with food obsessions.
Okay, so I'm glad you said that, Dave, because I'd forgotten, but then of course I remember as I'm watching it, Gnaghi's food choices.
Oh my God.
And the manner in which he consumes them are just delightful.
It reminds me of somebody.
Hey, wait a minute. But I think it does also contribute to his being perceived as the village idiot. The fact that he'll eat anything, he eats it, not in a quote civilized manner.
He's a growing boy. He's got to eat.
Well, it also contrasts with Francesco, who only eats pasta with marinara sauce and drinks wine.
Mm.
It's the, one is it's always a neat plate. He eats it carefully, even when shooting zombies during it. And the other one just piles everything on and is a slob. Mm. It's just another point to compare them as opposites. That
moment when Gnaghi takes the two plates that he's created together and he doesn't give it to Francesco. He goes downstairs to have dinner with Valentina. Like the look on Francesco's face, I think it's like one of the first times he has to see him as somebody who operates outside of his relationship with him. Like the idea that Gnaghi is his own person. Yeah.
I will say one of the things that I'm shocked and embarrassed that I didn't realize this until recently. One of the co-producers, Conchita I can't remember her last name. She was in one of the actresses in Torso that she got into producing, and she was one of the co-producers on this one. In fact, I think she produced Argento's last film, Dark Glasses, as well.
Oh, really?
And I saw her name recently. I got to see Torso on the big screen again, and I seen her name, and I'm like, wait a minute.
Italian film industry is very, very connected.
Yep.
For sure. On that interview with Rupert Everett, does he talk about how he came to the project?
Yeah, he does. I mean, he talks about, a lot about all that stuff. And I mean, from his perspective, he thought that the script was so wild and weird and different that's what drew him to it. And he wanted to do it because it was so out there and wacky. In fact, when they talk with the screenwriter, he comments on how he and Soavi thought of, well, maybe we should try to make this make more sense and have more of a typical narrative. So he went and he worked on it again and did a different draft that they sent back to Everett. And he came back he goes, if this is the draft we're going to do, then I don't want anything to do with it. The original draft is what made me want to do this movie. I really like that. He's like, what you got here is just something a world that already exists. We've seen this already. So I have no interest. So if we're going to go back to that, then count me in. So then, which the screenwriter and Soavi were kind of like, yes, okay, we're onto something. So let's just run with that. The funny thing is how a lot of the other people that worked on the movie, they all kind of talk about how he was kind of, distance himself and off-putting, and he had this dog that was mean, and he kind of had to keep to himself. I mean, they still say nice stuff about him, but they're kind of like, well, at first I thought he was this, and then, I just understood he needed his space, and I mean, I guess him and Soavi did have a pretty contentious relationship where, Soavi would say we'd start the day as friends and then quarrel, and next day we'd make up, and there was a lot of that going on. So, I mean, however it worked, they got this great movie that they did, and it obviously worked in the end.
I haven't gotten to play with all the features. Did they mention because he tried to get a U.S. remake off the ground around 2000-ish that they couldn't get the rights for? I've read it in passing. I was just
Who tried to?
Rupert Everett.
I don't
I've read about it
believe
like
they
once or
mentioned
twice in Italian stuff. So
Yeah.
I've always been curious, but I could never find more about it. Just they tried, something fell through.
Well, when they talked to the screenwriter, he mentioned that that Soavi and them had brought up the idea of doing a sequel or doing a series or things like that, and the screenwriter's like, I don't want to do it. I don't want anything. He goes, maybe a series would be okay because that'd be different. He's like, but to me, this is a movie that should just be left alone. It should stand as it is. And so he's like, so I told Michele that I don't have any interest in doing another one. He's like, he said, because it's so obscure and it wasn't a huge success when it came out and all that stuff, you know, that he's like, it should just kind of maintain what it is and be left alone.
There was a Dylan Dog film, though.
Don't talk. No, it's not talking.
I'm just saying, and that might have either stemmed from the thought of a remake or put everything to bed after it came out that, no, we don't need anything else.
It definitely killed anything.
Yeah, it sure did.
But you also understand that at that time in Italy, the industry was going in the toilet.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it did have a famous English star or would be famous English star, he wasn't famous at the time.
Right.
So, and the fact that it took 2 years to get played in the States at a very, very, very limited, poorly retitling, it didn't get a big push. Yeah, all horror fans for the most part, knew about it. If they knew that it was retitled to Cemetery Man. It's just the circumstances of when the Italian film industry went to the toilet at the same time this came out.
Well, originally there was supposed to be, there was another director that had the rights, that Sclavi had given the rights to Dylan Dog too. So there was a director that was supposed to make the Dylan Dog. I'm not sure if that's the one that actually ended up making the movie that came out. I've never seen it myself, but that's how they got around it so that Soavi could do Dellamorte Dellamore, is because they went back to the source book, which originally the Sclavi had given Soavi a manuscript that was the unfinished book. And then later on, Tilda Corsi, her son, got a hold of the book and was reading it. And they were doing this exchange in schools where they would put books like a library, you put one in and take one out. And the authorities got their hands on it, and they were like, what the heck is this? Why are kids reading this? And that inspired her to be like, hey, this is something we should look into. And so that was the loophole of how they got around getting the rights to make a quote unquote Dylan Dog film without stepping on the toes of because that director was a friend of Sclavi, and apparently, you know, he had said, well, he had already told him he would give him his blessing to do it. And so that's why they ended up going with that.
I don't think that project ever came to be. The actual Dylan Dog film was years later.
Yeah, it's an American film from 2013, I think.
Yeah.
God, yeah, okay.
It's not. That's not.
Gotcha.
What's funny is I would never have heard of Dylan Dog had it not been for Dellamorte Dellamore. Like I came to Dylan Dog through this film.
They talked about it in the Fango article that I read originally. That was where because they do bring up all that stuff, even talking about how Everett was the inspiration for the character and all that.
Talk about the budget really quick, because a lot of the effects are realized. Well, they're almost all realized practically. There are some, like, you know, we talk about the floating blue lights where you can sometimes see the strings, and but I think there's something kind of lovely about that in its theatricality. Like, I think it totally fits in this presentation, that it doesn't have to be real. Like in some ways, I like seeing the wires because I'm like, wow, that's how they pulled this off. This was actually put together by human beings and not a computer. You know, like looking at it 30 years later, I'm just impressed by what they were able to pull off in camera.
Yeah, between the makeup effects, the settings of the cemeteries that they used, the giant moon.
Mm-hmm.
That, my God, that thing is ready to crash into Earth as big as it is in a couple of those sequences. But it does give you that once you're in the cemetery, you're in this surreal world. They create that beautifully.
Well, and I like the makeup where it's like you have this kind of like once they are dead, they go back to the earth and things start like immediately growing out of the corpses.
I think they
The
just
Mandrake thing was something important that he wanted. It was the thing that Soavi wanted, was to have the Mandrake, particularly that plant, had some kind of relation. It was just something that he was like, that connected the earth with the zombies, the returners. Sorry.
and not do something that had been done over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Because Stivalletti talks about how they didn't want blood and gore and splatter coming out when the brains were shot. They wanted, or the heads were shot. They wanted dust, and just to have it be more of like a pop, to have it be more representative of the earth being in there, and not have it be this big gooey mess. So Stivalletti was like, at first, I don't get to use all my tricks and fun stuff. He's like, but it actually ended up being a great thing that we did that, because it totally sets it apart, and it is a really cool effect, even where you can see like the dust falling after some of the little school kids get shot. You just see the poofs of dust still hanging in the air, something different.
But it also makes the last scenes really pop more. The hospital sequence, because then you get it in its bright red and splattered on white.
I think that all these things speak to how fully realized the vision actually was for this movie, that none of this stuff really happened by accident, that they actually had this realized and knew what they wanted to create, which in my mind is kind of like in a contrast to a lot of the movies that were coming out in the US around that time, which is a lot of like glossy, sort of like PG-13 slasher movies and that sort of thing. The urban legends and I Know You Did Last Summers and all that sort of thing. So I do feel like it's, and I think of going back to the whole 90s thing, it's like, and John made this point that maybe like the industry was ending around this time, but a lot of like these great Italian horror movies came out of the 90s. I mean, some of these opinions may be unpopular, but I think of like the Stendhal Syndrome as being one of Argento's like last great movies that kind of fits in with like all of the movies that he was making around that time from like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So for me, I feel like a lot of those 90s Italian horror films towards the tail end of the industry maybe are some of like the best examples of Italian horror.
Anybody else want to agree with that?
Nope.
How dare you?
I mean, I'm not saying that I don't like 70s and 80s, but I do think that like that was the last great few examples of some of the best of Italian filmmakers from that era, and then they went on to make what they made after.
Well, I think that's yes, that statement I think is true. Like outside of Soavi and for fans of Stendhal Syndrome.
But I don't think it was the films that killed the industry. It was just circumstance and the industry itself. So while I don't agree 100% with Stendhal Syndrome, I don't think the filmmakers like Argento and them were making bad films that killed the industry. I think the industry just kind of fell apart on its own.
Right.
So yeah, you can't look at the 90s and say, well, that's why the industry died. Right. No, not at all.
No.
I mean, I wasn't suggesting that. I mean, for me, it's just like when I think about the movies the bootlegs I was watching in the 90s, like Stendhal Syndrome, and also I was a different person in the 90s. But I still like, when I look at something like Dellamorte Dellamore today, I'm like, it still holds true. It's like when I watch it today, it's like I'm watching it in the 90s. Yeah. When I watch something like the Stendhal Syndrome today, it's like I'm watching in the 90s, which isn't to suggest that John and I go back on this, but like Stendhal Syndrome is not one of my favorite Argento movies, but I do think of it as being the end of like the real like Argento era as far as that's concerned. And I think you can point to some other examples from the 90s that kind of speak to that too.
That's a great place for us to kind of wind things up. Any final comments on Dellamorte Dellamore, or Cemetery Man, as the Philistines say?
Go buy the 4K.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have this. You have to have this in your collection.
You should probably say who it's from.
Severin Films.
Yeah, Severin.
And while you're there,
find folks at Severin.
Pick up The Sect and The Church that they also released in 4K.
Here, let me pop you up. Oh wait, there's more.
Don't show that.
that was just to dig the knife in.
I was gonna flip through the discs too, just be like, aha! But no, I got some.
But John's right. The Sect and the Church are definitely must-haves too. I mean, to me, Soavi only did those 4 films, and they're every one of them, for me personally, they're all essentials. I mean,
Yep.
I'm glad that we have fantastic editions of all of them. Even the Blue of Stage Fright that's out right now is still really good. Hopefully it'll get another boost even beyond that. But, you know, Cemetery Man was the last of the 4 that was unexplainably not available for the longest time. I mean, I had the VHS and the Anchor Bay DVD, but I never upgraded because I was always waiting for there to be a set like what Severin finally got together and put out there to be released. So, I mean, it's great that we have all 4 of his movies in such absolutely fantastic presentations.
That is a wonderful way to wrap things up. Thank you all so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I hope people do pick up that new Severin release and check out Cemetery Man. Dellamorte Dellamore. Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scale.